following podcast was recorded on Thursday, October 20th, 2022, featuring Sam Rines of Arbor Data Science. To hear the podcast in real time, you can sign up for a free trial at arborresearch.com or by emailing Gus Handler directly at gus.handler@arborresearch.com. You can also call Arbor Research and Trading at 1-800-606-1872. Thanks for your time and enjoy the podcast. Welcome everyone to the latest edition of Talking Data. I'm your host, Kristen Radosh with Arbor Research and Trading, joined today by our commentator, Sam Rines of Arbor Data Science. Good morning, Sam.
Good morning, Kristen.
Today, Sam discusses a staple that has gone under the radar. Sam, today we're going to talk about one of my favorite things. Since the Ukraine invasion, the price of wheat has been in the headlines, but there's no mention of the surge in coffee prices. Approximately 66% of Americans drink coffee every day. What's going on with this staple?
It's really interesting, right? Because at least in my opinion, coffee is one of the most important things. There's, a couple of things you look forward to in the morning, and one of them is that first sip of coffee. The other thing is the third cup of coffee. So I think it's really interesting that this has flown under the radar for a number of reasons. One, 2/3 of Americans drink coffee. This is not something that is, a few people drink it. It's much more, call it mainstream than a lot of things. And so the fact that the price has doubled, and you really haven't heard a lot of headlines about it. You haven't heard, Starbucks talking about it. You haven't heard coffee makers, et cetera, really talking about the surge in prices is somewhat interesting. Part of it is that when you go to buy a pound of coffee, it's a lot more than $2. What actually goes into coffee prices on the shelves and at a coffee shop is mostly marketing and rent. Generally. So I think there's a little bit of that, but it has absolutely skyrocketed. It's almost doubled in a couple of years. That's translated into CPI prints that are 15.7% year over year. It's one of those kind of under the radar staples that has, you can't really blame the Ukraine war for it. You have to actually look at the fundamentals here and say, what's going on with coffee and why has it gone up so much?
And let's take a look at coffee growers. Who are the largest growers of coffee beans?
Oh, it's far and away Brazil, far and away. That's the most important coffee producer. And a lot of the price of coffee, call it surge, that we've seen has been Brazil has had pretty bad weather lately, right? You have to have a lot of rain to grow coffee. You have to have the right soil, you have to have the water, and Brazil really has struggled with having enough rain, right? Like the rest of the world seems to be undergoing, it's had a drought recently. Part of the reason that you've seen a decline in the price of coffee lately was that Brazil got some rain and it looked like the crops would be a little bit better this year, but it's by far and away the most important coffee grower out there. Vietnam is number 2 and has continued to grow its presence in the coffee market, but you can't overlook Brazil. Brazil's kind of like the Saudi Arabia of coffee, right? How it goes, so goes the coffee market. So generally, that's the place to look. It's interesting on another level because it's not really the same producers that we would think of for most commodities, right? It's much more of a South America and East Asian driven production cycle. Generally, Ethiopia is somewhat important to the market and has grown a little bit, but you do have to really pay attention to what's going on in Brazil. It's probably, the price of coffee combined with a better crop is probably a little bit better for the Brazilian economy than people are anticipating. So that's another thing to watch that's kind of under the radar alongside Vietnam. Vietnam's been a surprising economy over the last year. They reopened and they didn't have the lockdowns that China's had. Their exports have really done well. So I'd be paying attention to Vietnam and Brazil as we begin to see the coffee production numbers come out. And if it's better than expected, they might actually be economies that outperform.
What has the growth pattern been in recent years, and has there been any change in demand?
There really hasn't. This is the interesting part, is that the places that are growing are the Philippines. I mean, that's a pretty interesting place, but it's not an economy that's going to, on the margin, really change the coffee, the overall consumption of coffee in a meaningful way. The European Union's kind of gone sideways. The United States, sideways. Brazil, sideways. It really haven't seen much of a growth in demand. China has seen some growth in demand, but it's really hard to track, right? Don't have great data coming out of China, but there has been some growth in China just based on how many stores Starbucks has opened, some competitors to Starbucks that have opened a number of stores. So there has been some growth there, but again, it's pretty hard to get a handle on. And so you've seen some growth in demand, but you really haven't seen the type of growth that you would expect. It's much more of almost a steady state and kind of a shift in the way that people consume it, whether it's at home or whether it's out, and how expensive that incremental cup of coffee is.
We want to take a look at Google search trend activity to see what's happening recently. And if we look back the last couple of years, what was the pandemic's impact on coffee?
Yeah, the pandemic's impact on coffee, like everything, the pandemic is going to have ripple effects for way longer than I think any of us really want. But the interesting thing is that right as the pandemic was setting in, everybody was working from home and everybody needed a new coffee pot. Everybody wanted to, figure out how to make a cup of coffee at home. You couldn't really go to Starbucks. You couldn't go to your local coffee shop. So you began to consume more coffee at home. That was an important shift, and particularly where there's kind of this battle back and forth about returning to the office, that's going to continue. People are going to consume more coffee at home than they are consuming out. If you have a prolonged work from home trend, that's going to have a little bit of a mix shift. It's interesting, once you had the economy begin to reopen, and kind of gain some steam. It was the first, call it Starbucks holiday surge in searches, where Starbucks began to have a lot of searches. And then you had it fall off a cliff right after that, after everybody went out shopping, got their Christmas or pumpkin spice latte. I mean, then everybody was like, okay, I had that, I'm kind of over it. And you again had the surge in, what am I making from home? I would say, you look at some of the recent earnings reports, Nestle kind of called out that they were having a little bit of a downtick year over year in coffee made at home, which I thought was kind of interesting in their pod segment. Haven't had there's always Keurig that you need to look at as well for the at-home process, but I do think that there's a little bit of a shift in kind of at home, at work, at home, at work. Do I go to Starbucks? Do I really want to leave the house and go get that $8 cup of coffee, or do I want to sit at home and have a 25-cent cup of coffee? So I do think that there's going to continue to be this debate, and that's going to be a longer term shift that I think we need to pay attention to.
Sam, in summary today, what else should we be watching for?
I would really be watching what happens with Brazil and Vietnam. Those two economies are very important to coffee, and coffee is very important to the economy. So I think it's really interesting to watch Vietnam in particular. That has, again, been a very surprising economy. It's been fairly steady state. It's gained a lot of traction with the issues in China and manufacturing there. So I think over time, you're going to see much more interest in investing in Vietnam as a stable economy and a stable producer. And that could be a little bit of a shift. And again, it's not a large economy, so small and subtle shifts could be pretty tremendous in terms of the value of its currency and the overall trajectory for the economy. So I think that's a really interesting one to watch. And I'll be watching Keurig, Starbucks, et cetera, to see what their narrative is around coffee being up 100% and whether or not they're going to try to convince consumers that they need to pass that on.
Thank you for your thoughts today, Sam. We appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining us. If you have any questions on Arbor Research, Bianco Research, or Arbor Data Science, you can contact us by emailing Gus Handler at gus.handler@arborresearch.com. Enjoy your cup of coffee and have a great day.